NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This episode contains details of child murder and sexual abuse. Listener discretion is strongly advised. It was 1986. Patty Bastian was frantic. Her 13-year-old daughter Jennifer, Jenni to her family, was not home more than 2 hours after the time when she'd said she'd be home, which was 6:30 p.m. Patty had called all of Jenni's friends she could think of, but no one had seen her. After 2 fruitless hours, Patty called the Tacoma Police at 8:30 p.m. She explained that her daughter Jenni had left a note at the family home around 2:30 that day, August 4th, saying she was going out on her bike to Point Defiance Park. Jenni was an avid and accomplished road biker and was training for a bike tour to the San Juan Islands she was going on with the YMCA. She rode to Point Defiance Park and did the 5-mile drive loop there several times a week. Patty answered the dispatcher's questions. Yes, her daughter always wore her white and red striped helmet. Yes, her bike was in working condition. No, she had never run away. She was punctual and reliable. And no, she wasn't on any medications. Police knew the area to be very safe, the residential and recreational areas where Jenni had allegedly gone, featuring a very low crime rate. Patrol units immediately started searching Point Defiance Park for the description given by Patty Bastian. Meanwhile, responding officer Dave Wiltfong went to the Bastian home. Patty gave a formal description of Jenni as a 13-year-old, thin, white girl with blonde hair, cut short with bangs, and blue eyes. She looked younger than she was, her mother remarked. She was possibly wearing black stirrup pants and a t-shirt over a bathing suit, and was wearing white sneakers. She was riding a new champagne-colored men's 18-speed Schwinn Tour Deluxe bike with blue saddlebags. The saddlebags could be loaded with bricks and towels, so Jenni could simulate riding with her heavy, bulky camping gear. Patty reiterated the story that Jenni had left a note saying she'd be home by 6:30 p.m. She took her bike training seriously and wasn't typically later than expected. Patty said she'd talked to one of Jenni's friends, Carrie, who had heard from her earlier that day. Officer Wiltfong went to the home of the girl named by Patty as Jenni's BFF. Carrie said that Jenni had told her to meet up with her at 6 o'clock, and she hadn't shown up. She was never late. Something must have happened. Police searched the Bastian home and the home of Patty's mother, who lived about a mile and a half away. Nothing. Ralph Bastian went to pick up Jenni's 15-year-old sister Teresa at the movies, where she'd gone with friends. He was crying when he picked her up and told her that Jenni was missing. Meanwhile, patrol officers had no luck finding Jenni at Point Defiance Park, and darkness fell. A formal search began. At 10:38 p.m., officers from the Tacoma Police Department brought in tracking dogs. They were given a clothing item of Jenni's to sniff, and then they started out from her home. The dogs apparently detected a very strong scent, and they tracked Jenni northbound on her street, Winifred, to North 26th, where they went over to Pearl. They entered Point Defiance Park and tracked a very long trail around the entirety of 5 Mile Drive to Vashon Viewpoint, Bridge Viewpoint, Nisqually Viewpoint, Madrona Day Camp, the Midget Street Gate to the south exit road west of the Pearl Street entrance. There, they lost the scent. At 5:30 a.m., both dogs were done. They had not found Jenni. Based on their behavior, their handlers felt that Jenni had definitely been in the park and had completed at least one lap of 5 Mile Drive on her bike, but no one knew where she'd gone after that. At 6 a.m., the Bastians, Ralph and Patty, were briefed on the negative results of the search. I cannot imagine the feeling of dread that must have settled into their very souls when the police showed up empty-handed. Jenni was gone. Let's talk for a moment about who Jenni was to give you some context. Jennifer Marie Bastian was born on April 21st, 1973, to Mom Patty and Dad Ralph. Her older sister Teresa was 15 when Jenni disappeared. Although she was 13 years old, Jenni was tiny, 4 foot 10 inches tall and just under 90 pounds. She had blonde hair cut in a pixie, blue eyes, and an adorable pointy chin. Jenni was about to start the 8th grade at Truman Junior High in Tacoma, where she was a very good student and had quite a few close friends. The family lived at 2123 North Winifred, about 3 miles from Point Defiance Park. Jenni was very active, described as not someone who sat still. She was on a gymnastics team and loved doing cartwheels and back walkovers, but her number one love was biking. As Patty explained to the police, Jenni was an avid road biker and was planning a long-distance biking and camping trip with her YMCA biking group. The bike was just months old, a gift to Jenni from her parents. She rode the Schwinn in training sessions 3 times a week. She usually rode with her friend Carrie, but Carrie was unavailable on that Monday, August 4th. So Jenni loaded up her saddlebags with gear, left her parents a note, and headed out on a ride. It was very hot that day, and she wore her black and blue TYR brand one-piece bathing suit and packed a towel, presumably so she could cool off at Owens Beach inside the park. Just a quick aside about Point Defiance Park. This is not your average city park. The Tacoma Metro Park System website describes it as a 760-acre gem that is an urban oasis within the city of Tacoma. Flowery language aside, the massive park is a mecca for recreationists of all types. It is on a peninsula and surrounded by water on 3 sides. It has beaches and a marina, multiple floral gardens, a Japanese garden, a zoo, playgrounds, kids' camps, and a fort. And acres of woods, crisscrossed by running, biking, and horseback trails. Police knew based on the scent dogs that Jenni had made it to the park. While some officers and volunteers gathered to search the park on the 5th, which I'll get into, others sat down to interview the family and gather a list of Jenni's friends to contact. Ralph Bastian told police the last he heard from Jenni was at 1:30 when she called him and said she was going out on her bike soon. As I mentioned, this was typical behavior for her and Ralph didn't question it. The police asked the Bastians whether Jenni would accept a ride with someone. The answer was no, but she might accept help if she had a mechanical issue or a flat. Everyone also agreed that if someone tried to abduct her, Jenni would scream. Police pulled 15-year-old Teresa, Jenni's sister, aside and asked her if there was anything about Jenni they should know, any secrets or issues. The answer was no. Jenni was as sweet and innocent as Ralph and Patty described her. Police notes after these interviews say, quote, Jennifer seems to be stable, and there is no reason to believe she would stay out all night or leave town without contact with her parents, end quote. She wouldn't. Police quickly contacted some of Jenni's friends. A teenager named Ken A. was with 2 buddies, one named Dean and Jenni's friend Carrie. These were 3 of Jenni's closest friends, and Jenni's parents said Dean was the closest thing Jenni had to a boyfriend. Ken, Dean, and Carrie saw Jenni that day on her way to Point Defiance. They stopped and talked to her on the corner of 26th and Winifred. This was around 2:15 p.m. Ken was able to relate in detail what Jenni was wearing, pink shorts and a white crewneck top with shoulder buttons. These turned out to be wrong. but he did accurately describe her red and white striped biking helmet and biking gloves with gray leather palms. Patty told the detectives that instead of the white shirt, she believed Jenni was wearing a blue t-shirt with the word Castaways printed in large font on the front and a gymnast logo on it. The t-shirt was affiliated with the Tacoma Family YMCA, where Jenni was an active gymnast. Her mom said she wasn't sure which shorts her daughter had on, as she had several pairs, but they turned out to be a pair of blue gym shorts. It was possible she was also wearing black stirrup pants because they were missing from her room. One thing Patty was certain of, Jenni was wearing 2 sterling silver bracelets on her right wrist, a gift from her father that she never took off. And Patty confirmed that she was wearing a bathing suit, the black and blue one-piece. The Bastians were also able to provide the serial number of Jenni's bike, which was new and was a serious piece of equipment. As police continued to search the park, news broadcasts went out very quickly describing Jenni, what she was wearing, and her bike. The police obtained from the YMCA a duplicate of the shirt Jenni was believed to have been wearing, and photos of the shirt and Jenni were broadcast on local TV stations. The case received a ton of media coverage, including live interviews and shots from within the park, interviews with the family, interviews with the police, and so on. The story of the missing teen who had vanished from Point Defiance Park was a big deal. Police officers took Jenni's photo to businesses along the route. Nada. 2,500 flyers with her picture and information about her disappearance were posted and handed out inside and outside the park. Searches of the massive, topographically diverse Point Defiance Park continued for 3 full days, from August 5th through the 7th. The park remained closed during this time. Tacoma Fire Department fireboats were deployed to search the water and beaches on 2 sides of the park, in case Jenni had plunged down one of the park's cliffs into the sea. A police chopper did numerous passes over the entire area. Approximately 230 search and rescue volunteers searched the park's interior on the 5th, 6th, and 7th, assisted by police who coordinated the search on foot, on ATVs, and on horseback. It was estimated that 5,806 man-hours were expended on the search over those 3 days. Patty's employer AT&T loaned 4 massive, clunky, primitive cell phones to aid communication. On the 7th, quote, at approximately 20:30 hours, all search and rescue coordinators held a meeting regarding the search of the park. All were in agreement that the park had been searched completely and no trace of the victim had been found. Officers rechecked the search maps and noted that the park had been searched by several different means. Officers then suspended the search and recalled all volunteers. The ground search for Jenni Bastian was over. Police believed, based on numerous thorough passes through the park, that she was not on the grounds. From that point on, the case was treated as a kidnapping, and the Seattle FBI was involved. The family was advised to be home for a potential phone call from a kidnapper seeking ransom. Detective Pat O'Malley updated the family daily on the search results, but there was nothing to report. A live press conference was held on August 8th from within the park. The police and the Bastians made an appeal for Jenni's return and for people to call in tips about anything they could, where in the park Jenni was taken from, when, and by whom. And hundreds of tips started to flood in.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
There were many reliable sightings of Jenni and her bike with the distinctive blue saddlebags that helped inform the timeline and location. An employee of Point Defiance Park named Steve W. saw Jenni, he thought, around 2 o'clock. She was riding her bike toward the park's 5-mile drive entrance. She had a blue shirt tied around her waist and was wearing a blue and black bathing suit. She was alone. Nick L. saw her around 2:45, taking a break at an overlook in the park. Nothing seemed wrong. Martin G. saw Jenni twice between the hours of 2 and 2:30 on 5-Mile Drive. The first time he saw her, she was sitting on a log, resting. Nothing looked wrong. The second time he saw her, she was riding her bike alone. A friend of Jenni's from school saw her in the park between 4 and 4:30. She was on her bike. He waved at her and she waved back. Cheryl O. saw Jenni biking in the park at 4:45. A woman named Alice H. reported having seen Jenni riding by her home around 5 o'clock. One set of witnesses actually talked to Jenni. It was in the late afternoon, but they didn't know the time. Kenneth G. said he and his buddy had been out in his car driving around, and they ended up parking at the second viewpoint on 5 Mile Drive, the Dalco Passage viewpoint. They were sitting on a log drinking beer, and a young girl rode into the viewpoint and stopped her bike and sat straddling it. Ken said hi to her, and she said hi back. He asked where she lived, and she said she lived nearby, gesturing. She said, "I'm out riding. I'm getting ready to go to the San Juan Islands." The girl took a drink out of a white container after dropping her helmet on the ground. The bike had blue saddlebags, and Ken described the girl as a white female, about 11 years old, 80 pounds, small, thin build, with short blonde hair and a boy cut. She was wearing a white helmet with white tennis shoes and blue shorts, and she had 2 silver bracelets or a silver necklace wrapped twice around her wrist. James T. reported that around 5:30 he saw Jenni biking toward the Pearl Street entrance to Point Defiance Park. He noticed her because she was so young and had such professional biking equipment. He was into biking himself, so he took special notice. A witness named Robert E. called in a report that he had seen Jenni between 5:30 and 5:45. She was on her bike near the Point Defiance Park Zoo. She appeared to be heading toward 5 Mile Drive. Richard described her perfectly, down to the biking gloves. He was interviewed again multiple times because his sighting was later in the day and believed to be one of the last credible sightings of Jenni. Sergeant Stanley Mowry, the investigative supervisor, talked to Richard again on November 7th and asked Richard how he could be so certain about the time when he'd seen Jenni. Richard said he had phoned his wife from the zoo as he was supposed to pick her up from work at 6. He was just leaving the zoo when he saw the girl. He noticed that she was very small, but she was dressed like a professional bike rider. He yielded to her at a stop sign before he drove on. This is a quote from Mowry's report. Due to Richard's sighting of Jennifer wearing her swimsuit, it is believed that this is a very viable sighting, end quote. Multiple people had called in about a young, slim, short-haired blonde girl in a Speedo-type swimsuit at Owens Beach, swimming and sunning herself. Oddly, Ralph and Patty personally got a call from a man named Kirk J., a Metro Park employee, who told them he'd seen Jenni riding her bike between 2:30 and 3 near the Owens Beach entrance. His description was consistent with Jenni. Detective Lindbergh interviewed a female juvenile at Wilson High School who was biking in the park with her friend Tanya S. that day. Her name is redacted in my files, so I'll call her Sarah. Sarah and Tanya spent the afternoon of the 4th at Point Defiance Park, riding their bikes on 5 Mile Drive. Around 5:30, they had done a few laps and were resting at the bowl area inside the main entrance. Around 5:45, a girl Sarah was certain was Jenni stopped near the bowl area and was also resting there and stretching. Sarah described her perfectly, a young white female with a blonde pixie haircut under her white and red striped bike helmet, wearing blue shorts and a red, white, and blue Speedo-type bathing suit. While she was parked at the bowl, she took off her aqua-colored t-shirt and stored it in her bicycle saddlebag. Sarah even remembered that Jenni's bike was a tan Schwinn. Jenni then left the entrance area and headed into the park toward 5 Mile Drive at about 6 p.m. Sarah's friend Tanya was also interviewed and confirmed all of this. It was around 6 o'clock. They had stopped for a rest at the bowl. A girl described as Jenni stopped and got a towel and something to drink out of her saddlebag. She stayed for about 3 minutes and then took off toward the Japanese Garden Pagoda. Tanya paid attention because the girl looked so young and was by herself. She described everything, including the saddlebags on the Schwinn. Several others called in and reported seeing the blonde young girl with the blue saddlebags. It was clear that Jenni had covered a lot of ground on her bike that day. But after putting the credible sightings into a timeline, they now knew Jenni was alive at 6 p.m. She had promised to be home at 6:30. Something had happened to her in that last 30 minutes that prevented her from doing so. And then there was a reported sighting of Jenni that gave police their first suspect in her disappearance. Police interviewed 3 teenage boys who were biking in Point Defiance Park on the 4th. These were Ron L., Scott L., and Mike B. Mike knew Jenni from school. Around 4:10 p.m., they were fairly certain of the time. The boys were riding the wrong way down Monster Hill, entering 5 Mile Drive. 5 Mile is a one-way. It circles through the park in one direction only. They saw Jenni near the picnic area overlooking the lighthouse. She was coming toward them, biking up the hill. She looked hot and sweaty, and a man on a bike was following her. It appeared each time she would speed up or slow down, this man would do the same thing. The boys referred to what he was doing as drafting, a biking term that means riding closely behind someone else to cut down on wind resistance. Jenni didn't appear to be afraid, and the man had a determined look on his face. The boys lost sight of Jenni after she passed them because they were going in the opposite direction, but they all got a good look at the guy drafting behind her. He was described by Ron and Scott as a white male, aged 21 to 25, about 5'9", thin with sandy, wavy hair to the middle of his ears and possibly a mustache. Mike thought he was closer to 25 to 30, clean-shaven and taller, and recalled that he was tan. He was wearing a black or blue helmet, black bicycle shorts, dark mirrored sunglasses, and Nike tennis shoes with red stripes. They all agreed that this man was riding a black, racing 10-speed bike, Huffy brand. An identikit composite of the man seen drafting behind Jenni was prepared with help from the boys, who agreed that the sketch looked like the man they'd seen. It aired on all the local TV stations and ended up bringing in hundreds and hundreds of tips. Some of these tips were notable, such as the one phoned in by some girls who reported a guy in the park that day who was staring at them, the guy who reported seeing a blue hatchback nudging a girl on a bike, a creepy guy seen ducking into the woods in the park, a female jogger who felt that a guy in a pickup was following her, a female biker who reported a guy in a truck had tried to stop her bike, another female biker who said a male biker in mirrored sunglasses tried to pick her up. These sightings, although concerning, weren't all that helpful because none of the tips included any names for these men, and plenty of the tips were the much more generic kind, as in, the guy in the sketch looks like my cousin. They were all documented and followed up on, if possible. This bike guy was definitely considered the number one suspect in Jenni's abduction, but of course he couldn't have carried her out of the park on his bike. How could he have extracted her without causing a scene? And Jenni had been seen alone after the man was seen riding behind her. By October 1986, police were discounting the mirrored sunglass-wearing cyclist as a suspect. They soon had a different theory. They soon learned of another sighting, possibly of Jenni being placed into a vehicle. Police received a call from a female who said her tenant, a man named Luther S., was despondent because he felt he had witnessed Jenni's abduction. Police interviewed him, and here's what he said. On August 4th, Luther had been walking in Point Defiance Park going down to Owens Beach. He was carrying his little girl on his shoulders. Around 2:30 or 3 p.m., a girl on her bike whizzed past him. She was wearing a helmet, a short-sleeved shirt, and shorts. She was slim with short blonde hair. 45 seconds to a minute later, a male biker also passed Luther. As he passed, he said, "What's up, man?" After they both rode by, a shiny black van pulled up right beside the girl as she got ready to turn down the hill. Luther noticed the van because it had a tinted cover over the license plate. You could see the plate, but the tinted glass was somewhat unusual. Anyway, the van pulled over next to the biking girl, who stopped her bike, and the driver talked to her out his passenger window. Luther could see the side of his face in the side mirror, and he heard what the guy said, "Didn't I tell you to get in the van?" Meanwhile, the guy on his bike who'd been riding behind the girl pulled up behind her, got off his bike, and grabbed the girl. From inside the van, the driver opened the side door, and the bike guy threw the girl and her bike inside. The door closed, and the van drove down to the beach with the guy on his bike following. At the beach parking lot, the bike guy put his bike inside the van and they drove away. Luther didn't think much of this event at the time. He said he thought the guy in the van was the girl's dad and she was in some kind of trouble. Luther reported that the girl looked shocked, but she didn't scream. But after he heard about Jenni's abduction, he was freaked out. Police put a lot of stock into this sighting. They had a witness to the abduction. The decision was made to hypnotize Luther to try to get the maximum information out of him about everything he'd witnessed. In his hypnosis session with a Dr. Janet Kaplan on August 16th, Luther was able to remember quite a bit of detail. The van was a shiny black 1979 Ford Econoline with a round rear bubble window and a metal rack on top. It had black tires with Keystone rims. Dr. Kaplan pressed Luther on the license plate. He knew it was from Washington State, but he couldn't remember all the digits. They might have been XY2491. He did remember that the van bore a "Beam Me Up Scotty" bumper sticker. Under hypnosis, though, Luther had a revelation. When the bike guy grabbed the girl, she hadn't screamed because he put his hand over her mouth. He said, "There's something wrong with this scenario." Luther said the girl was wearing shorts, a white top, a red and white helmet, and white sneakers. She was skinny and her bike was too big for her. He recalled 2 side pouches on the bike, but thought they were brown and the bike was red. Luther described the man on the bike. He wore a tight black Adidas tank top and black bike pants. His bike had racing handlebars just like the girl's, and it might have been Fuji brand. Police believed that Luther had very likely seen Jenni's abduction. They released a drawing and description of the van to all the newspapers, saying that Jenni was believed to have gotten into it after mechanical trouble with her bike. They retained some of the actual details as holdback information, hoping the van driver would come forward. They collected a ton of tips from people who had seen black vans matching the description. They ran a search of registrations in the state of black vans with similar license plates. The search for the van was intense and thorough, until it wasn't. By August 20th, newspapers reported that police were no longer interested in the black van. They said this was because they had reliable witnesses who had seen Jenni well after the time Luther had seen this supposed abduction, which was 2:45 p.m. We know Jenni was seen by multiple people as late as 6 o'clock. But also, I think police knew who drove the van they were looking for, and he had painted it white. I'll get to him when we discuss suspects.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
By late August, desperate for more concrete leads, police were going back to the original tipsters and re-interviewing them. Patty Bastian still held out hope that Jenni was alive, but it was not to be. On August 26th, a male jogger named Leslie Yu was running the Point Defiance Park trails with the YMCA running club. 3 men, including Leslie, were running together on a wooded trail perpendicular to 5 Mile Road, near where it branches off from Grubble Road. About 1,000 feet from where the trail branches off toward the cliffs overlooking Commencement Bay, the runners smelled what's called a foul odor. They all noticed it and commented on it. A report about the smell said, quote, "They discussed it and figured if it had been Jennifer, the dogs would have found her and it probably was just a dead animal," end quote. Leslie was distressed enough about the smell that he decided to report it. So police returned to the area, which had been searched with dogs more than once, and searched it for 2 days. Tacoma PD's Sergeant Margerson scoured the area with 2 German Shepherds but found nothing. On the 28th, they decided to search it again with the aid of search dogs from Search and Rescue and the Park Police. At approximately 2 p.m., one of the dog handlers, a Mr. Gideon with Search and Rescue, radioed, "Bingo." Detectives Roger Price and Doug Margerson headed to the area. They followed the volunteer searchers' voices, saying, we found her, over here." Arriving at the area indicated by Mr. Gideon, Detective Margerson got on his hands and knees and crawled into a hole in the brush. After a moment, he crawled out backwards and said he couldn't tell if it was Jenni, but whoever was in there appeared to be wearing biking gloves and tennis shoes. Only one person had gone missing in the park wearing biking gloves and tennis shoes. Detective Price called for Sergeant Mowry and Detective Wolf Werner, who would become the lead detective on what was now a homicide investigation. Meanwhile, as Detective Margerson walked on the trail back toward the paved road, he found it. The bike. It had been there the whole time. It was buried under leaves and branches to the south of the trail, but it was clearly Jenni's Schwinn, complete with saddlebags. Sergeant Mowry requested that someone contact the chaplaincy program. He knew what the find meant, and someone needed to prepare the Bastian family that their hopes of finding Jenni alive were over. Detective Pat O'Malley went to the Bastian home in the late afternoon. Patty was keeping busy painting the dining room. O'Malley gently conveyed Sergeant Mowry's conviction that the bike and the body were likely those belonging to Jenni. Back at the scene, Sergeant Mowry and Detective Werner went to see the body for themselves. They made sure to take the path walked by Detective Margison before them, so as not to disturb any footprints left by the suspect. Because it was obvious that Jenni had not placed herself where she was found, someone did this to her. Around 8 p.m., Detective Werner, Detective Jean Brame, and Sergeant Mowry went to the Bastian home and met with the family personally. Meanwhile, the decision had been made to leave everything in place for the remainder of the night. By now it was dark outside and visibility was nil. Multiple personnel from the Tacoma PD and the Parks Department were called in to help secure the park. Officers immediately secured 5 Mile Drive, letting no one in. The park was closed and would remain so for 2 days. Police covered the body and the bike with tarps to protect them from the rain that was falling. They roped off the entire area and left the scene under guard of officers and dogs overnight. Mobilizing for the morning, the Tacoma PD requested the assistance of the Green River Killer Task Force, who had probably more expertise than anyone else in the United States at processing outdoor homicide scenes. They also called in Thurston County Deputy Coroner Dr. Mark Papworth, who was an anthropologist from Evergreen College and an expert in plant life. Dr. Papworth had recently taught a class on serial killings and was a recognized expert in outdoor crime scene evidence. At daylight on August 29th, Tacoma PD, Park Police, King County Green River Task Force Sergeant Frank Etchley, FBI Agent Bob Agnew, Dr. Papworth, and others assembled in the park. Media was already assembling and had to be contained by officers. The team elected to process the bike scene first, as it was closer to the trail. The bicycle was found on the other side of the hiking trail from Jenni, 15 feet from the trail. It was lying in an impression behind a very large maple tree. It lay on its right side with its front wheel facing north. It still had the blue saddlebags intact. Dr. Papworth seemed to read quite a lot into the positioning of the bike. This is a quote from his report. From what I observed, the bike appears to have been wheeled hastily and lifted bodily into its final position. The subject was either left-handed or unfamiliar with multi-speed bikes or both. All serious riders mount and wheel from the left to avoid contact with the bulky sprocket mechanism on the right." End quote. Following tire tracks and impressions, Papworth felt that the bike had made entry to the woods from the hiking path and was briskly wheeled to the impression behind the large tree and dropped on the ground. It was covered with fern fronds, stripped off a nearby fern bush. Quote, "This track was at the north edge of a large sword fern plant, which had several fronds missing. These fronds had been torn off approximately 1 foot above the ground. Fronds, which matched those missing from the plant, were found lying across the rear wheel and left saddlebag of the bike. Judging from the shrinkage they had undergone, I estimate that they had been broken off for more than 2 weeks." End quote. That from Dr. Papworth's report. Human footprints mirrored the trajectory of the bike tires. Again, a quote, "The pathway between the rear wheel of the bike and the sword fern showed considerable disturbance and mixed footprints, suggesting more than one trip between the fern and bike. None of the apparent tracks were clear enough to cast or photograph, with the exception of one. This print was deeply impressed immediately north of the fern's root mass, suggesting a left foot firmly braced against the job of tearing the fern stems." End quote. The suspect had evidently grabbed a frond and stripped it with his hands, so he had to plant his foot and grab more firmly to rip off some whole fronds. It was noted that this footprint was slightly smaller than Papworth's own size 11 and appeared to have been made by an athletic shoe. Papworth's notes directed, quote, "Detectives will approach the bicycle on hands and knees with magnifying glasses, tongue depressors, and other tools, searching the foliage on the ground area from the pathway to the bicycle for any trace evidence the suspect may have left behind." End quote. The fern fronds, sticks, and foliage on the bike were all collected. Then the bike was very carefully removed using ropes and a long pole to lift it. It was placed over a clean white sheet which was stapled around it and secured in a suspended position in the police van. Then Assistant Medical Examiner Wayne Eaton arrived and it was time to approach the body, which lay 100 feet off the trail. It's hard to describe, but Jenni's remains had been well hidden in a dark, circular cave-like area formed by low-hanging coniferous tree canopy and low-lying brush. Detective Margison described it as a small opening in a brush canopy formed by blackberry bushes and other foliage that had grown or been sewn together. He crawled inside and found a small clearing approximately 5 feet wide and 4 feet high. No sunlight penetrated the area because there were so many branches bowed over it, forming a little roof. Dr. Papworth wrote, quote, "All of the surrounding foliage formed a dense canopy which enclosed and concealed the body," end quote. Later, Dr. Wolf Werner would describe the clearing as a lair, with branches bent over deliberately in order to obscure the inside. It was no wonder search teams hadn't given it a second look. It had been hidden on purpose. In the small clearing, Jenni lay on her back, with both arms above her head. Her legs were spread, with the right leg jutting out straight at a 45-degree angle, and the left leg also being at a 45-degree angle from the hip but bent at the knee. Her bicycle helmet was not on her, but her biking gloves were on both hands. She was partially clothed and in an advanced state of decomposition. Her skin had blackened, particularly in the head, shoulders, and abdominal and pelvic areas. Her legs were paler, more yellowish. Her blue shorts and bathing suit were around her right ankle. Otherwise, she was nude. She still wore her tennis shoes and socks. I'm going to tell you right now that I'm not going to give you all the details on the state of Jenni's remains. Some things don't need to be said. I will give you some excerpts from Dr. Papworth's report because they help the investigators draw some conclusions about what had happened. Quote, "A missing upper incisor suggested an initial violent blow. 2 strands of stout cord remained around the neck, suggesting ligature strangulation. Larval samples and the presence of a wide range of insects associated with decay indicated an advanced state of larval occupation. Given the hot, dry conditions of August 1986, it was over 90 degrees on several days and hadn't rained for over 40 days. The state of insect activity supported the conclusion that the body had been in place without significant disturbance for more than 2 weeks and less than a month. A period of 24 days would fit the evidence nicely," end quote. Jenni had been missing for 24 days. Dr. Papworth concluded quickly that she had been killed almost immediately upon her abduction. The doctor noted that the body exhibited signs that Jenni's throat had been cut by a sharp implement, likely after the ligature had been applied. The lack of blood trail suggested she'd been killed where she lay. Quote, "I would guess that she was arrested by 1 or more hard blows, strangled into unconsciousness or submission for the trip to the hiding place, and finished off with a knife at the conclusion of this semi-ritual slaying," end quote. So the whole time Jenni had been believed to have been abducted and taken from the park, it was, in fact, extremely unlikely that that had happened. There was no way the suspect had taken her out of the park only to bring both her and her bike back. No, the whole time, she had in fact been just 150 feet from 5 Mile Drive. And then this from Dr. Papworth, thinking back to the bike being dumped behind a tree and loosely covered by brush. Quote, "While the body was handled with meticulous planning, the bike was not. This suggests it was not part of the perpetrator's fantasy. This could mean that Jennifer was not a specific target previously identified in the park. She always had her bicycle, and it would have been included in this strategy. Rather, it suggests that Jennifer was a generalized target of opportunity. A scene and fantasy were established for a young girl, and the victim was selected when the time was right. She happened to be riding a bicycle," end quote. What was most disturbing of all was Dr. Papworth believed that the canopy area had been pre-selected and prepared by someone very familiar with the park. Based on dead broken branches, he deduced the suspect had pre-cleared the way in and was, quote, "merely awaiting a victim after selecting the site." All the crime scene stuff that was typical for 1986 was done, and then some. The entire scene was photographed, and the triangulation crew measured everything out. The medical examiner's office bagged Jenni's feet and hands and lifted her onto a clean white sheet on top of a piece of sheet metal. The entire thing was transported up the hill and placed in the ME's van. Detectives and forensics folks decided to sift the dirt under where the body had been. They divided the area into loose quadrants based on what part of Jenni's body the dirt was under. For example, quadrant 4 was the area where her upper right arm and face were. They started meticulously sifting the dirt using sieves and magnifying glasses, and the painstaking work paid off. Detectives Werner and Price found 2 of Jenni's teeth, which were believed to have been loosened by a blow and perhaps fallen out as her body broke down. 3 foreign brown pubic hairs were found on the ground where the area between her legs had been. Also, under her body was a single white hair that was determined to be animal hair. The entire scene was processed with lasers. Various items were collected from the foliage and ground. A fiber on the ground east of the trail, a small piece of hair adhering to a branch on a bush, a Pepsi Light can east of the trail, a Coca-Cola bottle east of the trail, a fiber on the ground, a paper napkin, and a Schmidt beer can east of the trail. Jenni's autopsy was conducted on the 29th at the office of the Pierce County Medical Examiner in Tacoma by Dr. Emmanuel Laxina. Jerry Eaton of the King County Latent Print Lab began a laser examination of the tiny 85-pound body. Several fibers fluoresced, one on the top of Jenni's left shoelace and several fibers on the Velcro attachment on her biking gloves. Then the body was examined with a black light, which did not reveal any significant fluorescence, meaning no seminal fluid was detected, but this could have been because of the advanced state of decomposition. As I said, I'm not going to get into the exact state of Jenni's body. She was extremely decomposed, and much of her skin and many organs were missing. With partial mummification of some parts, she was identified through dental records, even with the 2 missing teeth. The pathologist was looking for a skull fracture, you'll know why shortly, but didn't find one. Instead, as mentioned by Dr. Papworth, he found a small diameter cord ligature still encircling Jenni's throat. It seemed similar to baling twine. Analysis of the ligature used on Jenni noted it was a 67-inch long by 1/8 of an inch diameter piece of cotton twine. The ligature still had a small loop in it, so that someone could insert a finger into the loop and control the amount of pressure on Jenni's throat. It was both a method of control and the murder weapon. Jenni was wearing her black and blue one-piece bathing suit, size 34. She wore blue shorts, size small, with USA 1984 on them. They were both pulled down all the way around her right ankle. She was too decomposed for the autopsy and lab testing to determine if she'd been sexually assaulted. But the foreign pubic hairs recovered from the ground between her legs and her clothing, having been removed and her body posed, indicated that she had. Dr. Laxina's report concludes this 13-year-old white female, Jennifer Bastian, died of asphyxia secondary to ligature strangulation. The appearance of the clothing indicates sexual assault. In consideration of the degree of decomposition and the prevailing climatic conditions, the time of death is believed to have occurred on or about the 4th of August. The manner of death is homicide. Just a note here that Dr. Papworth's observation that Jenni's throat was also cut turned out not to be correct. It may have appeared that way due to decomposition around the area where the ligature was tightened around her throat. Detectives had to go notify the Bastian family that dental records had confirmed officially that the body found was their Jenni. She was still wearing the silver bracelet and watch her mother had described to police. Patty Bastian planned Jenni's funeral, but was horrified when the Tacoma authorities would not release Jenni's body to the family. The testing and analysis and everything took a long time. Eventually, it was agreed that Jenni's body would be provided for the funeral, which was attended by 1,600 people. The community, reeling from the murder and other recent tragedies, gathered together to mourn innocents lost. Ralph, Jenni's father, penned his daughter's eulogy, and then the Bastians had to return Jenni to the medical examiner to be available for further review. It was just too much to bear.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
An autopsy of sorts was performed on Jenni's bike as it was processed for evidence. This bike was new and Jenni took very good care of it. Investigators wondered if it had a mechanical issue or Jenni had an accident, but it didn't look like it. While the paint was scraped away all the way down to the bare metal at the top of the right front wheel fork, and there was additional paint scrape damage on the bottom side of the front frame support, the chain was on and both tires were fully inflated. The bike hadn't been hit or crashed. In the saddlebags on the bike were multiple items belonging to Jenni. A pink and black Velcro wallet contained 3 $1 bills, some change, and 7 school-sized photos of boys. Also stowed away were a Truman Heights Junior High School card in the name of Jenni Bastian, a Boys and Girls Club of Tacoma ID card, and a Tacoma Public Library system card. A water bottle, Jenni's bike helmet, the YMCA Castaways t-shirt, a dark blue long-sleeve sweatshirt, a pale blue sweatshirt, and black spandex stirrup pants were also in the saddlebags, as well as a brown beach towel and a Schwinn bike manual. Crime lab tech Tanya Zagire Powder developed 2 latent fingerprints on the bike frame. These were entered into AFIS with no hits. A lot of work was done trying to determine whether Jenni or the suspect could have been the last one to ride the bike, or if the bike could give any clues about where it had been ridden. The detectives took photos of the bike to the bike shop where Jenni had it serviced and spoke to a Mr. McNeely. He determined that the bike was in 17th gear when it was found, which meant that whoever pedaled the bike was either going downhill or was very strong. At a bike shop called Skier's Edge, the employees set up a bike in the 17th gear and had Detective Werner try to ride it. They decided Jenni was definitely going down a very steep hill, necessitating such a high gear, or if it was being ridden in a flat area like the trail, it had to be someone with very powerful legs. Jenni's friend Carrie, who usually biked with her, backed this up. She couldn't think of a single place in the park that would necessitate 17th gear. Investigators continued to work the scene for days. There were innumerable meetings among the investigative personnel assigned to the case. Detective Wolf Werner, Detective Margison, Detective Price, Sergeant Mowry, Detective Larry Island, and so on. They had a lot to talk about. You see, this had happened before. In fact, it had happened just months earlier. While Jenni was still missing and yellow ribbons symbolizing homecoming adorned the trees at the Bastian home and around the neighborhood, Patty Bastian had received a visit from a woman named Barbara Welch. Barbara's daughter, Michella, had been slain in an unthinkable and unsolved crime in a Tacoma park just months earlier. Patty said later that while she recognized that Barbara's heart was in the right place, the visit upset her. Her daughter was not dead like Barbara's. Jenni was still alive. But then Jenni was found, and everyone hearkened back to Michella's case just 4 months prior. Michella Yvonne Welch was born on June 7, 1973 in Georgia, to parents Michael and Barbara. In 1986, she was 12 years old and lived in Tacoma with her mother's boyfriend, and 2 younger sisters, Angela and Nicole. Michella had a small group of friends in her 6th grade class at Grant Elementary and was on the quieter side. She had played the piano for 3 years, and she played the violin, and she was always seen reading a book. She loved games and was into drawing, spending a lot of time with her sketchpad. She was described by her school counselor as someone who was very pretty, dressed more like an adult than a child, and came across as somewhat maternal. She was known for her pink glasses. She got along very well with grown-ups and was very respectful and polite. On March 26, 1986, Michella was babysitting her sisters over their spring break from school. Their single mom, Barbara, had just started a new job, and at 12 years old, Michella was old enough to supervise her 11 and 9-year-old siblings. The 3 girls left their home around 10 a.m. to bike or skateboard. One of the younger girls was pulled on her board behind Michella's bike to Puget Park. Their home was at 1516 North Oaks Street, about 1.5 miles from the park, located in the 3100 block of North Proctor. Unlike Point Defiance Park, Puget Park was small, only 1/2 block in size. It had a playscape and a picnic table and room to run around, and there were quite a few kids there that day. Puget Park abuts a large area commonly referred to as a gulch, a wooded, brushy area extending 1/2 mile eastward from the park to Ruston Way. The gulch was commonly used as a cut-through to and from the waterfront area and was traversable by trails. The gulch was known for being home to transients, as it abutted some railroad tracks and was a common party spot for high school-aged kids who used it to build small campfires and drink. Around 11:45 a.m., Michella returned home on her bike. A classmate saw her as she was leaving the park. She went home to get lunches her mother had prepared for them and called her mom at work. She asked if it was okay for the girls to go to the park and then go straight to her piano lesson. Barbara didn't want the girls at the park for that long. That was 5 hours. So she said no. She didn't know that the girls were already at the park, and Michella didn't tell her. At home, Michella tidied up the house a bit, grabbed the bagged lunches, and biked back to the park sometime between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. She went to the picnic area where she had left her sisters, but they weren't there, although her sister's bike was. It would turn out later that around 12:45, the younger girls had gone in search of a bathroom. While there, they used a payphone to call the house, but Michella didn't answer. Then they called their babysitter, Linda, and told her Michella had been gone for a while, and they were heading back to the park to wait for her. Back at the park, Michella chained her bike up and placed the lunches and some Easter candy on a picnic table. She sat down and began eating her sandwich. When Michella's sisters returned to the park around 1 o'clock, they didn't see her, so they went and played near a cave under the adjacent bridge connected to the gulch for another half hour or so. Michella's sisters returned sometime around 2 p.m. The brown paper bag lunches sat on the picnic table, Michella's lunch partially consumed. Michella's bike was there, but she was nowhere to be seen. The girls walked around calling her name, but they couldn't find her. They started heading toward the gulch to look for her, but the babysitter, Linda, walked up. She had come to the park concerned about the girls calling her. When she couldn't find Michella either, she called Barbara at work. Barbara rushed to the park, found the girls and Linda, and called the police at 3:06 p.m., who told her to wait 24 hours. Barbara, who said later that she had terror in her heart, insisted in a state of panic that police look for Michella. So at 3:10 p.m., the Tacoma PD sent out patrols and officers on foot looking for the blonde, 12-year-old girl dressed in a t-shirt, a turtleneck, sweatpants, a purple jacket, shoes, socks, and underwear. Unlike Jenni, it didn't take long to find Michella. Search and rescue tracking dogs came upon her body around 11:15 p.m. She was hidden under brush in the gulch. She lay in an isolated area within the gulch described as a large fire pit type area, more than a quarter mile from where she was last seen. She was found 60 yards off a gulch trail and would have had to have walked from the park down the main gulch trail onto a lesser-used trail, over a creek, and up a steep hill. The spot was clearly, deliberately selected for being isolated. Michella was lying on her back with her head turned to the left. Her hands were clenched and had mud on them. Her arms were extended out from her body just below shoulder height. Her upper body was clothed with a white shirt and tan turtleneck sweater. Both had been pulled up just above her ribcage, and both were bloody. She was nude from the waist down, her legs twisted to the right and somewhat apart. Her dark knee socks still covered her lower legs to the knees, but her pink pants and lavender underwear clung to her left ankle, with the pants leg turned inside out. Her left sneaker was off and located a few feet away. Her lavender coat hung on some brush 23 feet from her body. When investigators moved her body, they found a 3 7/8-inch folding pocket knife and sheath under her right leg. Very oddly, Michella had a key on a small key ring sitting on her chest. She also had a small digital alarm clock she carried on the ground between her legs. An autopsy on Michella, who had been dead just a few hours when she was found, determined that she had died from blunt force trauma to the right side of her head, which caused a 3-inch diameter depressed skull fracture near her right temple. The skin was not broken, indicating she was hit with something smooth and consistent. She also had a 7-inch laceration to her throat. This cut was deep but did not reach the major veins or arteries. The edges of the cut were clean, and the slice was delivered from left to right. Michella also had a 3/4-inch long laceration on her left cheek, which may have been a knife wound. Police thought this was perhaps from a knife being used to control her as she was walked to the area of the gulch where she was found. She also had a small defensive wound to her left hand and a deliberate cut to the bottom of her vaginal opening. There was a fresh bruise on the back of her right arm that could have been from someone grabbing her, as well as other bruises and abrasions on her sacrum, right knee, right lower thigh, and other parts of the legs. Finally, she had fingernail marks on her upper chest and lower neck, likely where someone held her down. This is taken from a later FBI profile on the case. Quote, The blunt force trauma was to the right side of the head near the temple. The massive damage to the skull indicates that the head was supported probably by the ground at the time of this blow. It was described as a major compressed skull fracture, approximately 3 inches in diameter but with very little defect in the skin, suggesting something fairly smooth and consistent was used as a weapon. No such item was located at the scene. There was a broken tree branch on the ground near the victim with blood on it, but it did not appear to be capable of causing the injury to the head." End quote. Blood on the tree branch turned out not to be Michella's. No one was 100% certain which injury had been inflicted first, the slashed throat or the head injury. But the fact that her head was turned toward the left, with the bludgeoned right side of the skull facing up, indicated that Michella had not moved after that lethal blow was struck. She had no blood on her hands, indicating she hadn't reached for her throat when the slash was delivered. What was certain from the evidence was that Michella had been forcibly walked to the area where she was found and silenced so that the suspect could sexually assault her. Lab tests conducted on rectal and vaginal swabs and a right thigh swab taken at her autopsy showed the presence of semen and intact sperm. The whole unthinkable act had gone down right where Michella was found. The Pierce County prosecutor Mark Lindquist said even seasoned police officers were shocked by the scene. There was ample physical evidence. Foreign hairs, both pubic and body, were recovered from Michella's body and purple jacket. Feces at the scene and smeared on her chest and shirt and jacket, suspected to have been deposited by her killer, was analyzed and determined to contain rare parasitic larvae. This parasite was uncommon in the U.S. and was more common in equatorial regions of the globe. A length of small-gauge cord with looped knots hung from a nearby branch. And the jacket I just mentioned hung on some brush 23 feet away and was incredibly bloody, indicating Michella had been wearing it when her throat was cut, and the sleeves were inside out, which implied that someone had pulled it off her body.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
There were no witnesses to Michella's abduction. However, 2 composite sketches were made. The first was of a suspicious man seen by a woman named Mary Brown on the afternoon of the murder coming out of the gulch where Michella's body was found. This man was described as a white male, 35 to 40 years old, 6 foot 4 inches tall with thin build, a thin face with hollow cheeks and a 5 o'clock shadow, dark blonde hair worn short on the sides like a crew cut and wavy on top. He was wearing a tan windbreaker, tan pants, and a brownish plaid shirt. He was walking very fast and was hunched over and looked frightened or paranoid. The witness thought he might be a mental patient because he seemed so odd. Because he was so shifty and was seen leaving the gulch area with rapidity, he was considered a possible suspect. The second composite was a suspicious man who had been seen loitering all around the main trail in the gulch below Puget Park about 2 weeks prior to the murder. The trail winds through the gulch and eventually comes out in Puget Park. The spot where this man was seen by a park employee named Deborah Mathis was 200 to 300 yards from where Michella's body was found. This man did not want to be seen and jumped into the bushes whenever Deborah appeared to look at him. Deborah saw him around 9 or 9:30 in the morning, and he was still around later after lunch when she returned up the trail. He was a white male, middle 40s, 6 foot to 6'4", 210 pounds, of medium build with straight dark brown hair above the collar and some gray in it, and a bushy, dark brown mustache, and he needed a shave. He was wearing a black vinyl hip flank jacket and tan or khaki pants. There were 2 other possible sightings of the man who might have taken Michella. According to information in the Tacoma News-Tribune, a 13-year-old classmate of Michella's, whose father was a detective, later told detectives he saw a man in the park that day under the Proctor Bridge who kept looking at the girls. He was described as white, 24 to 26, 5'9" and skinny. He was wearing a blue jean jacket with holes in it, blue jeans, and dirty, ripped white tennis shoes. A teacher from Michella's school reported driving by Puget Park between 1 and 1:30 p.m. and seeing Michella speaking with a man pointing toward the gulch that ran from the park to the waterfront. The man was described as possibly Hispanic, 25 to 35, 5'8" with black hair, a possible mustache, and light-colored clothing. And a 15-year-old boy named Randy C. came forward after seeing Michella's photo in the paper. He had been skateboarding at Puget Park on the day of the murder. He was later determined to likely have been the last person to see Michella alive. At right around 1:30, he saw her walking around the park as though she was looking for something, or someone. She then returned to the picnic table where some lunches were set out. He went under the bridge to take a leak, and when he came out a couple of minutes later, she was gone. He didn't see anyone else nearby at the time. Another boy at the park reported he heard a scream, but he thought nothing of it. Parks are full of screaming kids. Surprisingly, the pocket knife found under Michella's body had no blood and no fingerprints on it. Testing on the foreign pubic hairs found on Michella's vaginal area and foreign head hairs on her jacket were determined to be from a Caucasian person. Blood typing analysis conducted by a company called Serologica on the semen taken from Michella's body determined that the semen donor was an ABO type B or AB non-secretor. According to the lab report, ABO type B and AB non-secretors occur in only 3.2% of the Caucasian population. But who was he? From March 26th until Jenni Bastian was taken and then found, detectives were all in on Michella's case as a standalone. They pursued all the typical investigative avenues, excluding men in Michella's life using blood type and hair comparisons. For example, Barbara's boyfriend and later husband Ken Bonfietti was ruled out because his hair didn't match those in evidence. Michella's biological father, Michael, was ruled out too because he was confirmed to be in California where he lived when she was killed. Police tried to find a man known to local kids as the Bridge Troll, described as a Hispanic transient male with a large build who frequented the Gulch. There were reports that he had tried to drag a young girl under the bridge and that he had been seen there on the day Michella died, but police never found him. The police interrogated all the sex offenders who lived in the area, and although they felt it was likely that a, quote, sex pervert was involved in this crime, they eliminated them all. They found a man who had been seen in the park loitering around the search and rescue team as they searched the park. When they tried to talk to him, he jumped into a car and ran away. They found him through a license plate ID and eliminated him. There were 1,200 names on the investigators' list, but no standouts. All in all, blood, hair, and/or saliva samples were collected from 150 men. Police struck out time and again. They did not believe that Michella, who was cautious and a little timid, yet fiercely protective of her sisters, would have gone off with a stranger. But everyone the police could find who knew her was ruled out, and then Jenni was killed and the remote possibility of a stranger abduction suddenly became a probability. After Jenni was found, it wasn't really a question of whether the two cases, hers and Michella's, were related. They had to be. The similarities were impossible to ignore. In fact, Police Chief Don Ramsdell called the similarities overwhelming. Let's review them. The victims were petite, blonde, white girls who exhibited age-appropriate behavior and led low-risk lifestyles. Both girls were riding bikes that day. Both girls disappeared from and were killed in public parks 3 miles apart on the north end of Tacoma. Both girls were killed in brazen daytime abductions and homicides. Both girls were found with their lower clothing dangling off one leg and at least one shoe on. Both girls were positioned the same way, on their back with arms outstretched and legs apart. Both girls were hidden in brushy covering. Jenni was hidden a lot better than Michella. Cord or baling twine was found at both scenes. It was around Jenni's throat and hanging on a bush in Michella's scene. Foreign pubic hairs were found at both scenes. And it was noted that at both crime scenes, detectives found a tennis shoe impression that wasn't deep enough to be photographed but was distinct enough to take a measurement. The shoe was believed to be a tennis shoe and was about 10.5 inches in length. The investigators checked with the head of the shoe department at Nordstrom's to learn that a 10.5-inch measurement would translate to a man's shoe size 7 or 8, relatively small. There was no way these horrific murders were committed by different offenders. There were just too many parallels. It was clear that this killer had learned from Michella's murder, and rather than risk Jenni being found so quickly, had planned the location where he hid her in advance. In late September 1986, Detective Wolf Werner submitted the cases to the FBI's VICAP. He requested that an offender profile be generated by the FBI's behavioral profiling team. He presented to them 3 cases, Michella's, Jenni's, and that of Carla Ann Wright. On the morning of January 7th, 1980, 12-year-old Carla Ann Wright was walking to school in Tacoma. Her mother, Sharon, usually drove her to school, but she couldn't that day, so Carla set out to cut through rows of homes in her neighborhood on a trail to Gray Junior High School. She never made it. 12 days later, on January 19th, her body was found in a wooded area 100 yards from the trail she had taken, hidden under a large piece of plastic. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. Carla's body exhibited evidence of ligature strangulation as well as marks on her wrists, indicating that she'd been bound in restraining devices. Neither were found. Semen was found in her oral, anal, and vaginal cavities, but no sperm cells were actually located, suggesting that her killer could have had a vasectomy. Her murder remains unsolved. The FBI Academy in Quantico issued a letter with a criminal personality profile prepared for Detective Werner. It says, quote, "A positive linkage between the behavior observed in the Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian homicides indicates that the same offender is responsible for both crimes. We cannot state that the person responsible for the murder of Carla Wright is definitely the same offender." The profiler hypothesized the following about Jenni, quote, "The close proximity of the bicycle to the victim's body and the absence of significant damage to the bicycle indicate that the victim was approached by the offender while she was standing with her bike, and using some con or ruse, he convinced her to accompany him with her bike to the area near where the body was found. Immediately after leaving the paved roadway and while on the path, the offender gained control over the victim, possibly by looping the twine around her neck or showing his knife. As in Michella's case, the victim was forced off the path and into the secluded area where the offender quickly killed her and removed sufficient clothing so as to allow him to have intercourse with her body. Decomposition makes it difficult to make normal pathological examinations. However, her body positioning would indicate she was probably sexually assaulted." And here's the headline, quote, "The murders of Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian are linked by the location, time of day, size and appearance of the victims, manner of death, and a symbolic sexual motive for the attacks. There is little doubt that both acts were committed by the same person." I'm paraphrasing the rest of the profile here. The offender is a lone white male between 24 and 30 years old. We do not expect him to have much social maturity, and he will show little regard for his personal appearance. However, he was able to approach and calm the victims without frightening them. We expect this offender to be single or divorced. It's likely that other men consider him somewhat odd. At some point, he was influenced by a dominant female. His inadequacies developed from that point, and he is resentful of that person. He may engage in window peeping and other nuisance-type offenses, such as obscene phone calls. He may stare at women in public places. And for his employment, we can expect him to be employed in a setting where he would have the least amount of public contact possible. The daytime schedule of these crimes, noted to be extremely high risk, may indicate an evening or night shift. He has more than a passing familiarity with the area in which these crimes occurred. Finally, it's possible he had a bicycle, which may have attracted the girls to him or made them more comfortable with him. So going forward, the same detectives worked both cases, and while the cases had different TPD file numbers assigned to them, they were generally handled as one. In fact, a 6-person task force was formed after Jenni's murder to investigate both, led by Sergeant Stan Mowry. Investigators had run out of solid leads in Michella's case, but they now had fresh ones to go on from Jenni's case. The task force expended more than 10,000 investigative hours in the year after Jenni's murder. They investigated Jenni and Michella's cases from both the angle that they were connected and the small possibility that they were unrelated. Some of the leads in Jenni's case involved a blue blanket found within 75 feet of her crime scene. It had animal hairs clinging to it. Others were the pubic hairs that they now had at both scenes. These were microscopically examined and found to possibly be consistent. Police tried to gather the names of all Metro Park employees on the theory that perhaps, since both girls were killed in parks, they could find their suspect there. But with 916 of them, that was a near impossible task. Investigators interviewed Jenni's piano teacher's son, who was a weirdo. They talked to everyone who they could find who hung out at both parks, Puget and Point Defiance. They followed up on all tips about male bikers, feeling that perhaps both girls might have been comfortable with or even agreed to go with a man who bonded with them over biking. But then they found a man who became a suspect. Remember I referenced that the investigators had deprioritized a black van. Well, their suspect had had a black van but had painted it white since Jenni's murder. It's hard to describe this guy. He was essentially a transient who lived out of his van in the public parks around the Tacoma area. But he fancied himself a painter and artist, and decorated the outside of his van in brightly painted wooden panels exhibiting his art, in strong air quotes. He was known to spend a lot of time, in fact almost all his time, at Point Defiance Park, although he also admitted spending time at Puget Park. His name was R.J. Peters, but he had changed it to Randy Cezanne, as in the famous painter. Detective Roger Price first made contact with Cezanne in Point Defiance Park before Jenni was even found. This was on August 27th. So many people had called in his white van as suspicious and sketchy that when the detective saw it pulled over in the park, he decided to talk to the owner. Cezanne admitted hanging out at both Point Defiance Park and Puget Park, and he said he was surprised. Nobody had ever talked to him after the death there, referring to Michella's. That was odd. Scores of people called this guy Cezanne into the Tacoma police after Jenni's murder. He was seen all over Point Defiance Park on August 4th with his creepy van. One witness, a Phil McAllister, even reported seeing Jenni that day biking on 5 Mile, heading toward a sketchy white van with painted plywood on the sides, parked at one of the turnouts along 5 Mile Drive. In other words, Cezanne's van. Cezanne arguably could pass for the man depicted in the composite sketch drafting behind Jenni as well. Detectives went on a field trip with the witness, Phil McAllister, so he could show them exactly where he had seen both Jenni and Cezanne that day. He pointed to the spot where he saw Cezanne painting and to the spot where he saw Jenni on her bike. It was a 1/4 mile from the trailhead. Quote, "This would place Cezanne in a close proximity, not only to where Bastian was seen, but to where her body was found," end quote. 2 days after Jenni was found, Sergeant Mowry saw Cezanne's van in the park and requested a surveillance detail on the van. They ran Cezanne's prints and compared them to the Laytons found on Jenni's bike, but they didn't match. But that didn't mean much. Anyone could have touched the bike. On August 31st, Sergeant Mowry pulled Cezanne's van over and obtained a consent to search it. Cezanne was very cooperative, but in the van, the police found some baling twine, photos of nude women, paintings of very young blonde women and girls, and scores of writings that mentioned things like the cunning criminal mind and the word die over and over. They also found a wooden mallet-type item that matched the size and shape of the skull indentation on Michella's head. Mowry read Cezanne his rights and he agreed to be interviewed. They talked about young girls going to the park alone. Mowry was clearly trying to entice Cezanne to talk. And Cezanne said 14 or 15 is more trusting than older girls. He said that sometimes young girls came up to his van. That was creepy. Then he said he had a friend in the coroner's office who told him that Michella's throat was cut from ear to ear and she was brutally raped. This was not public information. Cezanne referred multiple times to, quote, homosexuals having killed the girls, and guessed that they had both been anally raped, which was true for Michella. For Jenni, they didn't know. He said he couldn't understand why a young teen girl would ride on those paths by herself, and he talked about Michella bringing sandwiches to her sisters. And then he admitted that he liked to ride his 10-speed bike on the trails in Point Defiance Park. He talked about the trails being a kind of maze in the woods and how he liked to deviate from the main paths. This was interesting because the place where Jenni was found was believed to have been chosen by someone who knew the woods and trails intimately. When asked about Jenni's case and whether he had any information like the kind he had in Michella's, he said he didn't, but he guessed her throat was cut like the other girls. At the time, police still gave credence to the observation made at Jenni's scene by Dr. Papworth that her throat had been slashed. During the latter part of the Cezanne interview, Sergeant Mowry noticed that the subject's hands were starting to shake. And Cezanne had a record for indecent exposure and a number of contacts with law enforcement because of complaints he was staring at women and girls in the parks. Records of law enforcement contact with him reflected that he lived out of his van and typically parked at Point Defiance Park's Owens Beach and near the Puget Park Gulch. Sergeant Mowry's notes state that Cezanne was a, quote, verified suspect, end quote. All of the investigators on the case, including Detective Werner, Detective Lindbergh, and Detective Larry Island, agreed that Cezanne was a suspect in both Jenni's and Michella's cases.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
On September 12th, Detective Werner and Sergeant Mowry went back to the scene of Jenni's crime and walked the area. And there was Cezanne in his van, parked in a viewpoint or turnout near the trail. A subsequent interview of a former housemate of Cezanne's, Michael D., revealed that Cezanne had told him he had been friends with Ted Bundy and used to hang out with him. Mike D. also confirmed that Cezanne had a bike and it was a black Huffy. Finally, on September 19th, Detectives Eiland and Lindbergh executed a search warrant for a search of Cezanne's person to collect hairs and blood and saliva samples. These samples were gathered at St. Joseph's Hospital, and then Cezanne was transported to Central Station for photographing and fingerprinting. Rather than speak with investigators, Cezanne opted to call his attorney, Ron Culpepper, who advised his client not to talk. Cezanne had to be released. Items of physical evidence, Cezanne's hairs, obtained pursuant to the search warrant, were forwarded to the Washington State Crime Lab to be compared against items found at the Michella and Jennifer homicide scenes. The ABO blood type testing by Forensic Science Associates showed that Randy Cezanne had type A blood, results that were extremely close to the blood type results from the testing of Michella's suspect's semen. But lab tests of the pubic hairs tended to exclude Cezanne. This lack of certainty resulted in Cezanne staying on police radar for years to come. And Cezanne didn't help his cause. In May of 1987, he was arrested after exposing himself to a woman named Diane T., who was walking in the park. Apparently, he'd been sunning himself in a red G-string style pair of underwear, and he took them off and stood there naked as Diane walked by. There were many more men who attracted investigative interest in this case. For example, Patty Bastian had called in a report about a man named Wallace, who had been contacting her and gave really weird vibes. She had first seen him loitering in the park with his bike right after Jenni went missing, when she was giving a TV interview on August 8th. He was wearing riding gear and had a black Huffy 10-speed bike. Wallace had approached Patty and said he had seen Jenni in the park on the 4th 3 separate times. He was inserting himself into the investigation in a very inappropriate way, and Patty noted that Wallace looked just like the sketch of the man in sunglasses riding his bike behind Jenni. Police interviewed Wallace on August 9th, and he was very nervous and shaking. His story was all over the place, and he lied to police about what color his bike was. He also claimed that he had called in his information to the tip line, which he had not. And Detective Eiland learned that Kenneth Bonfietti, Barbara Welch's boyfriend, was in the same Army unit as Wallace, and Kenneth had brought Barbara and her girls, including Michella, to a holiday party the year before at which Wallace was in attendance. That was a little bit too much of a coincidence for the investigators to write off. After Jenni was found and investigators were considering their list of POIs, they brought Wallace in and read him his rights in January 1987. He said on August 4th, he had seen Jenni riding 3 times around the grassy bowl at the park. One time she stopped and looked at her bike, and another time she was adjusting something on the rear wheel. Police confirmed Wallace owned a black 10-speed Huffy, but he had lied to them about that. However, he agreed to give head and pubic hair samples on the spot. But then he was polygraphed on January 20th, and Detective Larry Eiland's report from that date documents that Wallace failed the polygraph in his response to questions regarding his having ridden his bike in Point Defiance Park with Jenni. He was inconclusive, but leaned toward deceptive when questions related to having killed her or having caused her death. And Wallace said he heard Jenni had been strangled. That was not public information. I don't know what happened with Wallace's hair sample comparisons, but police obtained a warrant to obtain blood samples from him 2 years later, in February 1989. Okay, so you can hear what types of suspects the police were working with. These were guys who were in the park and acted unduly interested in the investigation and had been seen near Jenni. And there were lots and lots of others, men who looked like the composite and rode bikes in the park and were shifty, or men who committed similar crimes, or men who were seen lurking in the park. Police collected hair samples from them for comparison, and blood and saliva for blood type testing against the semen in evidence in Michella's case. By late 1986, they knew from testing on these hairs that they were looking for a Caucasian male suspect. Here are some examples of more men that they looked at. Douglas D., a neighbor of Michella's, who was called in by another neighbor reporting that he was a sex offender who liked little girls. The tipster said Douglas was known to run naked around Puget Park, and he was very familiar with both that park and Point Defiance. He was a loner who liked to ride his bike around the parks. The caller said that she and other neighbors felt that Douglas was a weirdo who could have killed Michella and Jenni. Detective Werner talked to Douglas's ex-wife, and she, too, felt that he was a very likely candidate as a suspect. Detectives included a photo of Douglas in a photo lineup and collected hair samples from him. Another guy, Brian Keith Lord, was a suspect in the rape and murder of 16-year-old Tracy Parker in Kitsap County in September 1986. Tracy was found bludgeoned to death and partially undressed. 12 years earlier, Lord, who was only 14 at the time, had killed his girlfriend's mother in California, but he got only 6 months because he was a juvenile. As an adult, he'd been arrested in California for attempted rape of a 14-year-old with a knife. Tacoma PD collected fingerprints, palm prints, and a mugshot of him. His blood type was compared to semen in Michella's case and hairs in both Jenni's and Michella's evidence. Lord was eventually sentenced to death. The Tacoma Police Department received a 2-page anonymous letter stating that a Sean E. looked like the composite in the Jennifer Bastian case. The letter writer claimed that Sean lived near Puget Park and spent time in Point Defiance Park and was there on the day that Jenni disappeared. The letter writer knew Sean personally and said that Sean said he knew who Jenni was. Apparently, this Sean guy told several people he had a 13-year-old girlfriend whose name was Jenni several months before she disappeared. Police learned that he had been known to stare at young girls and occasionally try to touch them. They also learned that Sean was a mental patient who was sometimes unstable and required intravenous injections of medication several times a week. Police interviewed Sean's psychiatrist, who could not offer anything that would eliminate him as a suspect, but said he wasn't certain his client was capable of the crime. Detective Werner and Sergeant Mowry interviewed Sean on November 14th. They questioned him regarding his whereabouts on both March 26th and August 4th. He admitted being in both parks, but could not recall specific dates. They asked him for blood and saliva samples, and he agreed, but he must not have given them because in January 1987, they ended up getting a warrant for Sean's hair, blood, and saliva. On April 1st, 1986, less than a week after Michella was killed, Detective Island learned of a suspect last named Fairley, who was arrested by Tacoma police for erratic and suspicious behavior. A records check revealed that this guy Fairley had been picked up by the TPD in January 1986, walking in the area of Ruston Way and North Alder Streets, shouting at cars and talking to himself. This area is on the waterfront side of the gulch below Puget Park. It was noted that Fairley matched the description of the suspect that had been seen acting suspiciously in the gulch below Puget Park 2 weeks prior to Michella's homicide. Detective Island noted that Fairley had been picked up by police very near where Michella had been found. He interviewed Fairley on April 1st, and he said he couldn't recall where he'd been on March 26th, but then admitted he'd been drinking beer in Puget Park. He couldn't explain why he was there. He said he'd just like to run around the park. Yes, he'd heard about the girl who was killed there. He heard she'd been shot, stabbed, and raped. Detective Island noted with interest that Fairley had a scab on his knuckle, which he said he got by walking into a door. Having no evidence to hold Fairley at that time, they let him go. But after Jenni's murder, Detective Island ran a records check on Fairley and learned something very interesting. He'd been committed to the Western State Mental Hospital in June of 1986, but had escaped. Guess when? On August 4th, 1986, he walked out of the mental hospital around noon. Jenni Bastian was killed after 6. They picked up Fairley and interviewed him, and he admitted that after he escaped, he went straight to Tacoma. He had cruised Point Defiance Park with a buddy on that day. Police obtained a search warrant for blood, saliva, and hair samples for Fairley, who sounded like a really good suspect. A local weirdo named Clifford D. had been seen wandering around about 150 feet from where Jenni was found, touching himself and muttering. Police questioned him and noted that he was very nervous, and they also talked to people who described him as the village idiot. Keep in mind this was the 80s. They eventually obtained a warrant for his hair, blood, and saliva. A guy named Andrew W. was on probation for indecent liberties and was tipped by his probation officer. Because he matched one of the composite sketches, he had a 10-speed bike that he liked to ride in Point Defiance Park, and he recently had started trying to grow a beard, so police wondered if he was trying to change his appearance. Andrew was asked about being in the park, and he said he knew every inch of its terrain. But then when asked why he looked like the composite and was growing a beard, he became evasive and started to deny that he rode his bike in the park at all. He had no alibi and refused to take a polygraph. Police eventually obtained samples from him through a search warrant. Marvin Carl Clausen was named by the head of the sexual psychopath unit at Western State Hospital as a possible suspect. He had multiple arrests for rapes and molestation in King County. His parole officer, Judy Davis, described him as a Ted Bundy-type individual who had abducted a 10-year-old girl, driven her to a remote location, and forced her to perform oral sex. Clausen was polygraphed with regard to both murders and passed, but he stayed on the list because he was a violent pedophile. Gordon and Carrie C. were an uncle-nephew duo of interest. Carrie, the uncle, had been arrested for peeping twice in the girls' restroom at Tacoma's Wright Park in August 1985 and December 1986. He admitted that he liked to jog the trails and make new trails in Point Defiance Park. He said he was very familiar with the trails and had jogged every one of them. He rode a black 10-speed bike and carried a pocket knife. He admitted in his interview with police that he fantasized about 12-year-old girls. In fact, he was being supervised through Good Samaritan Hospital for his fantasies. His counselor at the hospital said he had sociopathic tendencies. Furthermore, he had not shown up for a meeting with his counselor on August 4th between 4 and 7 p.m. Jenni R., Carrie's former girlfriend, quote, started to tell us things about Carrie that were quite interesting. He liked to make new trails and he liked to tie branches together and build a shelter-type design which has a canopy effect, end quote. Carrie had anger issues and got destructive when things set him off. And finally, when Jenni went missing, Carrie told his girlfriend Jennifer he knew that girl and he had to go down and help try to find her. He got angry when the police turned him away from trying to join the search. Carrie denied being involved in either of the homicides, but police got a search warrant in January 1987 for his blood, hair, and saliva. Gordon C., the nephew, was named for making comments about finding Jenni's bike abandoned in the park and taking it, riding it, and dumping it. According to a friend of his, he had even bragged that he'd seen Jenni in the park that day and she had touched his penis with Q-tips. Honestly, people are so weird. Gordon gave hair samples, but in May 1987, police obtained a search warrant to obtain additional samples from him in relation to both cases. This was because a report from a criminalist at the Washington State Crime Lab stated that the hair in evidence in the Michella Welch case exhibited some microscopic similarities to the pubic standards of Gordon C. They needed more hairs in order to conduct additional testing. A quote from Detective Warner, "Affiant has submitted numerous hair samples from various subjects, and this is the first time a similarity has been found," end quote. Gordon stayed on the list. Police expressed interest in talking to Harry David Fisher. Fisher had been sent to prison in 1970 for another child murder, the slaying of 13-year-old Laura Lee Burbank in Lakewood. Laura had been walking to a nearby pet store to get food for her pet monkeys when she disappeared. Fisher was an employee at the pet store who acted very strange and devoid of emotion when police interviewed him as a routine matter after Laura's disappearance. Her body was found in September 1970 by children playing in a brushy area off the Rainier Olympic Highway. Police linked Fisher to the crime and he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, even though detectives felt he had fully intended to kill Laura. Fisher was incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla, but he escaped in 1974 and was not in custody when Michella and Jenni were killed. He was finally apprehended in Canada in 1990 and questioned about their murders, but police concluded he was in Canada for the duration of the time he was on the lam, which included 1986.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.
Police investigators were desperate to whittle down the list of literally hundreds and hundreds of names of persons of interest that crossed their desks. The Welch and Bastian cases were huge. The case file I was provided in Jenni's case alone was 3,400 pages, and I wouldn't call it complete. One way to eliminate suspects once and for all was to cross them off the list if they could not have committed both crimes. The suspects had to be out of jail, be in Tacoma, and have no alibi for both March 26th and August 4th of 1986. Time and again, guys were ruled out because they were elsewhere on one of those two dates. For example, Michael Scott Hughes had been prosecuted by the Snohomish County Prosecutor's Office for statutory rape and manufacturing child pornography for videoing young girls in sexual situations. He had been released from jail on December 13, 1985. Detective Eiland looked into Hughes and learned that he was in Colorado at the time Jenni was killed. Therefore, quote, presumptive assumption can be made that he is not involved in the Welch homicide, end quote. In another example, numerous calls were received by the tip line about a Dale C. Dale had been arrested by the Pierce County Sheriff's Office for a charge of rape. He sued the county after he was acquitted. Detective Werner talked to Dale on October 16th and found out that he was in jail during Michella's murder, but was released before Jenni's. Quote, due to the fact that Dale C. was incarcerated during the time of the Michella Welch slaying, it is not believed he could be responsible for Jennifer Bastian's death, end quote. A tip was called in that Jeffrey Lawrence Wilson looked like the composite in the Bastian murder. Detective Werner found out that Wilson was in custody at the time of the Michella Welch murder. Quote, this effectively eliminates Wilson as a suspect in the Welch case, and a presumptive assumption can be made that he is probably not involved in the Bastian homicide. And another. Teddy Shepard, who had a background of sexual assault and kidnapping in Utah, was looked at, but he was incarcerated when Michella Welch was killed. Investigative notes say that based on the presumption that one suspect is responsible for both, this would effectively eliminate him as a suspect in the Bastian homicide. A lot of men were eliminated from contention for this reason, and this reason alone. At the time, it made sense. The task force of 6 full-time detectives investigating the 2 cases was disbanded by the first anniversary of Michella's murder in March 1987. Nonetheless, throughout the first half of '87, Tacoma police continued to follow up on all these leads and collect forensic samples from suspects, whether voluntarily or through search warrants. Nothing panned out. Then along came a suspect who looked very, very good for both murders. He became the prime suspect in Michella and Jenni's homicides for good reason. In June 1987, nearly a full year after Jenni was murdered, Gerald Arthur Friend was arrested for the kidnapping, rape, and torture of a 14-year-old girl. On June 5, 1987, this 14-year-old runaway had accepted a ride with Friend, who was not her friend, in the area of Tacoma Dome after he offered to buy her some food. Little did she know that Friend had been convicted in 1960 of the sexual torture and rape of a 12-year-old girl and had been paroled in 1980. He had also sexually tortured a 7-year-old boy when Friend was just 15. He had been labeled a sexual psychopath and given a life sentence for the 1960 rape, but nonetheless was a free man in 1987. Once his new intended victim was in his car, he restrained her, punched her several times in the face, and handcuffed her hands behind her back. He took her to his trailer and proceeded to assault and torture her. He tied her spread eagle to the bed and whipped her with a leather whip, slapped her, put hot wax on her abdomen, burned her with a cigarette and a propane torch, and bit her on the back of her upper right leg. He also cut her on various parts of her body. He suspended her from the ceiling by her legs by a pulley system he had installed, and inserted a large rubber dildo into her vagina. He also gave her an enema, and this interest in feces drew parallels to Michella's case. After all this, Friend handcuffed the survivor and made her lie down in the backseat of his car. She believed, in fact knew, that he was taking her to a remote location to kill and dump her. So, when he stopped for gas, she pretended to be asleep. When he went out to pay for the gas, she was able to open the car door and escape, running naked but for an unbuttoned denim jacket to some nearby Pierce County deputies. When they found her, she was all tied with cord, rope, handcuffs, and a leather belt. She was also gagged with a leather thong which had a metal loop at each end. The 14-year-old survivor described the man who abducted her as a white male, aged 55, 5'9", of average build, with black and gray scraggly hair, wearing expensive blue jeans and expensive tan hiking boots. She also described his vehicle, a large tan 2-door coupe with no inside door handle on the passenger side, and she knew where he lived. Police figured out pretty quickly that he was 49-year-old convicted child rapist Gerald Friend. As you can imagine, after hearing the horrific details of what was done to this girl, Gerald Friend immediately piqued the interest of Tacoma area investigators looking into Michella and Jenni's cases. And there were other reasons to consider him a suspect. Friend strongly resembled the description given by Deborah Mathis of the man she saw coming out of the Puget Park Gulch on the day Michella was killed there. Deborah picked him out of a photo lineup as most resembling the man she saw, although she wasn't certain it was him. Further, a search of Friend's trailer revealed that he had 3 small-gauge cords of varying lengths. They weren't all of the same type as those found in each of Jenni's and Michella's cases, but they did have loops in them, just like the cords in the girls' cases. And the 14-year-old survivor recalled that there was a German shepherd chained up at Friend's house. Police remembered that there was a long animal hair found under Jenni's body, and also shorter hairs on the blue blanket found nearby. Friend had suddenly and suspiciously given this dog away right before he was arrested. But police tracked it down and took hair samples from the tail of this German shepherd named Sheba, pursuant to a warrant. Blood, hair, and saliva samples were taken from Friend and comparisons completed by the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Investigative notes report, quote, "The comparisons of his pubic hair and hair from his dog are still pending in the Welch and Bastian cases. However, his blood and saliva have been examined by the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, and it was indicated that he could be the sperm/seminal fluid donor in the Welch case," end quote. Friend was such a strong suspect that the Green River Task Force also took a strong look at him as a potential suspect in the string of murders of women and girls in King County that was eventually attributed to Gary Ridgway. Friend, meanwhile, ended up getting 75 years in prison for the sadistic acts he committed on the 14-year-old survivor. So even though he remained free of charges in Jenni and Michella's cases, police knew he was unable to strike again. Okay, let's move on from the literally innumerable suspects and persons of interest in this case who were interviewed, searched, sampled, and surveilled. It all took years and years. I've never seen such an old case with so many search warrants. The TPD and Detective Wolf Werner continued to work the case, but the days, weeks, months, and then years ticked by. In 1989, Tacoma Police issued yet another plea for information about the Bastian and Welch cases. This time, police spokesman Mark Mann acknowledged that police had direct evidence that Jenni and Michella had been killed by the same person. He wasn't referring to new evidence, but the overwhelming similarities in the two cases, leading to the predominant theory that the two cases were linked. Mann said that by this point, 3 years in, the police had interviewed 3,000 people and had considered 400 persons of interest. This is the end of Part 1 of the Jennifer Bastian case. Part 2 is available right now.
NASCAR on Prime lights up Music City. Who's got what it takes to tackle the concrete at Nashville Super Speedway and walk away with NASCAR's coolest trophy? Stream the NASCAR Cup Series at Nashville, Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, where music meets motorsports, only on Prime.